Hello and welcome to EE233. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to take another look at our student course registration system demo, and specifically what we're going to do is focus on a function in our StaticArray.h called examine students. This video assumes that you have watched the earlier videos on setting up our student course registration system demo, including those focusing on the StaticArray.h. It would be helpful but not required that you also watch the video focusing on your display students and display student function, as our examined students will just simply take a closer look at that array. So to begin with, you want to make sure that you have your StaticArray.h open, as well as your scrs.h, and potentially also your core.h, and a copy of your students.csv. In our examined students function, essentially it's going to allow for us to drill a little bit deeper into the data structure of our students array. This function also has a similar function related to the courses and to the registrations that I would also encourage you to complete. So to begin with, we'll notice that we are passed a constant array of students and a count that simply tells you how many active students there are in the array. Keep in mind that we are not going to be reallocating memory in this particular demo, so we may have created the array much too large, but then we have to keep track of how many students are actually in the array. So for instance, if we utilized our student count max, there may be 30 students in the array, allocated enough room for 30 students in the array. However, in our sample file, we only have 5. So effectively, we've allocated much more memory than what we can use for this particular CSV file. So essentially, it's our responsibility to keep track of how many of those students are actually active or actually contain information. So what we want to do now in our examined students is we simply want to loop through our students array and print out a nice table, including things like our addresses in memory for each one of the fields in each one of our individual structures. So to begin with, what I'd like for us to do is to go ahead and declare an index variable that will allow for us to loop through our students, and then go ahead and set up a nice table here with the description and maybe the value. And you want to give enough room then so that we can include the field names. And we'll tweak this as we see fit. And then we'll also want to create a nice border here. In this case, I'm just going to use double equal signs, followed by a new line. And we're going to have one both at the beginning of our table and then also at the end of our table. Now, inside the table, then what we want to do is we want to start off first by printing the address of our students array, not any of the elements inside of the array, the actual array itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a printf statement that simply says address of the students variable. And I'm going to carefully try to line this up with a little bit of trial and error with the value header. In this case, I want it to be a %p for a memory address followed by a new line. And in this case, what I want to do is simply provide to it the variable students. And why can I do this? Well, because if you recall, an array is passed by reference or by address. So we're going to get the address of the first element of the array this way. The next thing we want to do is go ahead and set up a for loop utilizing our index variable, starting with 0, continuing on until we've reached the count, and incrementing by 1. And inside of the for loop, we want to print the address of each one of the elements in the array. And I'm going to borrow then this line of code just so that I can go ahead and roughly line them up correctly. And what I want to do now is I want to print out the address not of the array itself, but then of each one of the elements in the array. Now notice here I've added 4 spaces, so I'm going to attempt to line this up by deleting 4 spaces. And then instead of students, then what we're going to want to print is going to be the address of the students square brackets index. So essentially what this is going to do is give you the address of a element in the array. And remember that each one of the elements in the array are in fact structures, because this is an array of structures. Now what we want to do is we want to look at the individual fields just to confirm that we can get the values out of the individual fields. This is going to look a whole lot like our display student. As a matter of fact, you can probably go ahead and take an opportunity to borrow some code here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and specify students square brackets D, %D, and then I'm just going to manually put in the field names here. So it's going to be student underscore, then our status. So student underscore status. And then once again, tab it over and keep in mind the data type. So in this case, the status is going to be a integer. So we're going to use our %D. And then we're simply going to populate then that first %D with the index. And then that second %D is going to be populated by our students square brackets index. And then here is where we will use then the individual fields, in this case, our student status. Now let's go ahead and do this one more time, and hopefully then you'll see the pattern. In this case, what I want to do is I'll focus now on the student ID. So once again, I'm going to simply type in just the students square brackets and then %D. That part's going to be repeated because we're still going to be dealing with the same element in the array. But the field that I'm interested in is going to be the student underscore ID. And once again here, tab over, followed by a new line, index, and then it's going to be the students square brackets index dot student ID. At this point then we could probably just do a little bit of cleanup here, maybe to keep consistent with our display function. We can go ahead and provide the colons after each one of the descriptions. It's really up to you what kind of aesthetics you want for this particular table. Don't lose sight, though, however, of the purpose of this particular example. That is, we want to understand now how an array works, particularly an array of structures. So I'm going to go ahead and borrow some of the code here. You'll notice that I've just simply copied and pasted now multiple times. And just carefully going in and changing each one of the fields. You'll notice here that for the student ID, we want to have a %S. For the next field here, the student first name. Then it is also going to be a %S student middle initial because of the way we've constructed our structure is going to be a %S, and then the student last name is also going to be a %S. and then just simply go through and make sure that each one of your fields corresponds to what you have in the description. So in this case, it's going to be the first name, middle initial, and last name. Now, that gets us the address of the beginning of each one of our structures in our array. It gets us the values in our array, much like our display function does, but it doesn't tell us anything about the addresses of the individual elements in the array. At this point, what we want to do is sort of repeat what we've done earlier, but this time we want to combine the address of the student's square brackets %d. And in this case, we're going to focus first on the status, or rather student status. And this is once again going to be a %p because it's going to be an address. For the first placeholder, we want to pass the index. And then what we're going to do is employ the same trick that we did earlier, where we used the address of the student's square brackets index. But instead of looking at the structure as a whole, what we want to do now is we want to focus on the address of the student status field in a given student. We want to do this now not only for the student status, but we want to do it for the student ID, the student first name, student middle initial, and student last name. So once again, a little bit of creative copy and pasting, a little bit of careful tabbing, and a little bit of careful editing on our fields. And you should be able to complete the table now of each one of the addresses of each one of your fields. So we'll take just a second now to finish this up. This is going to be the student first name. Middle initial. And then the student last name. All right, let's see here let's see where we've got a problem here. We've got a typo somewhere here. Wrong number of arguments here. All right, so I've forgotten my index. There we go. All right, so before we go any further, let's just go ahead and make sure that we can build this. That looks promising. And what we'll do now is we're going to go ahead and test this in our student course registration system driver. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a similar approach to what we did in our display all, where we first made a call to our import students, and then we made a follow-up call to our display students. So as a matter of fact, what you probably want to do is go ahead and borrow then this entire block of code, as well as potentially our if statement, and just simply repeat it, changing the if statement to an else if, and the switch for this particular demo, we can simply have as examine all. This point, the only thing different is we want to make a call instead of to display students. We can simply make a call to our examine students. We'll go ahead and build it. We can come out to our command window, and you can see where we tested our earlier display all. We can simply, once again, borrow this, but this time around, instead of display all, it'll be examine all. And you can see where it just gives us a little more information than what the previous example did. And specifically what it's doing here is it's giving you the address of the entire array. Let's take a second here to see if we can't split our screen. It's giving the address of the entire array first. Then it's giving the address of the 0th index in the array. And you'll note that the address of the 0th index of the array is in fact the same as the address of the array. It then prints out the individual fields, not a big surprise there. It's basically what was imported from the file, including the student ID. But now, if you take a look at the address of each one of our fields, you'll see that the address in this case of the first user, F868, also matches the address of the first field of the first user. And this is not unique. If you'll notice now, for each one of your students, the address of the element in the array matches the address of the first field of the first element in the array, or rather the address of the first field of a structure matches the address of that structure in the array. And that is not accidental. That is by the order in which the elements or fields are established in your structure. So in this case, you'll notice my student status was my first field in my structure. Therefore, the address of the student status should match then the address of the beginning of the student structure in the array. Now we can do a few more things here to clean this up. We can perhaps line up our values a little bit better. I'm just simply going to go through, add an extra space. And then one thing that I'd like to do to make this a little clearer is I'm going to add an additional new line when we are done with an individual student. So I'm just going to simply pen down here another new line. You can also consider adding another border in between the students. Let's rebuild this and let's see if this looks a little bit easier to read. You can see now a little bit clearer that the address of the student status for my second student also matches the address of the second student's structure in its entirety. F8A0, F8A0. Notice also that within a structure, then the memory is essentially sequential, or it is in the order in which your fields are assigned, rather are declared. Now, I want to do one other real quick thing before we leave this particular demonstration. I do want to show you an alternate way of getting the address, or the value rather, out of a structure. This will come in handy later on, and that is we can also have students, square brackets, %d, and we'll focus on the student status, and then we'll go through the other fields. But you can consider this now an alternate approach to the earlier part, where we just simply use then the dot notation. Instead, what we can do, once again, for the student status will be %D, followed by the new line. Of course, the index is going to be our first fill in, our first placeholder. But what we're going to do differently is we're actually going to specify the address of the students array, specifically the address of a particular element in the array. But notice how we have an extra set of parentheses here. So we're essentially saying that we want to access then the address of a particular structure in the array. And then we can actually dereference then that address and look at a specific field in the particular structure in the array. And so this will get us the same thing as this. Now, this syntax will come in handy when we start passing arrays or elements in an array, when they're structures, when we start passing them by reference or by address, then we'll have to dereference them. At this point, let's do this one more time so we can see the pattern here. It's going to be students %D dot student ID. This is going to be then the alternate version. In this case, it's going to be a string. And so once again, we're going to first use the address of students square brackets index, but we're going to turn around then and dereference it to point to then the student ID. At this point, you probably have figured out the pattern here. We can do this now for the first name. Middle initial. And the last name. And we'll just take just a second to clean up our table. And at this point, we should now have two ways in which we can display the information in our array. And so go ahead and build it. We'll come over here to our command window. We'll rerun it with our examine all. And you'll see that in addition to the first way where we have directly accessed the elements using the dot notation, you'll see that you get your individual field values. You can also do the same thing with the alternative approach. And if you want to perhaps include then a better description of what that alternative approach is, you're more than welcome then to simply go ahead and copy the code that would generate those alternate values into your table. So at this point then, you should probably go ahead and consider doing this for your courses as well as for your registrations. So as always, I hope you found this video useful. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to email me. And thank you for watching.